Good evening, everyone. My name is Keith Williams, and on behalf of the Lancaster Conservancy, welcome to Nature Hour. Lancaster Conservancy's mission is to provide wild and forested lands and clean waterways for our community forever. We protect the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock, the Conestoga, and Shanks Ferry people, and I hope we care for these lands as well as these native peoples. For 50 years, our organization has sought out natural places that are so precious and beautiful, they must be protected. Our stewardship team works to restore these special places by removing invasives and planting trees. These preserves are then opened for us to use to hike, hunt, fish, and birdwatch 365 days a year. Special places like Shanks Ferry, House Rock, Kelly's Run, Wizard Ranch, Otter Creek, Climbers, and Welsh Mountain, and many others are protected forever. We launched Nature Hour with the goal of bringing an assortment of local and regional experts directly to your home with presentations that help us better understand the Conservancy's work and the work of our community partners. The format for tonight's lecture will be a 40 to 45-minute presentation with 15 to 20 minutes of questions and answers. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will include your questions as part of the conversation. This is the fifth lecture of our 24-25 winter season. Our next Nature Hour will be February 19th on spring ephemeral wildflowers. You can learn more and pre-register for this lecture and other events on our website, lancasterconservancy.org, under upcoming events. The Conservancy is blessed with incredible corporate support, and tonight we want to recognize our annual sponsors who include the Wenger Group, Clark Associates, Nimblist, Electron Energy Corporation, Eurofins, J Group, Dart Container, Prana, Armstrong, Commonwealth Financial Associates, PP&L, Cargis, and Penstone. And now I would like to introduce tonight's Nature Hour, exploring our Emancipation landscape, with Peggy Epic. Had the pleasure of being a colleague of Peggy for 30-some years. We worked alongside each other in Maryland doing different kinds of outdoor and environmental education, served on the same boards of organizations only at different times. And it's been my true pleasure to work alongside her here in the engagement department for a couple of years now at the Conservancy. She's an extremely talented educator, beyond knowledgeable. She currently serves as our conservation educator here at the Conservancy and leads our K-12 program. She holds a PhD in environmental history from Antioch University in New England. She teaches in the graduate and undergraduate environmental studies and sustainability management programs. In addition, she maintains research projects with the Institute on Pilgrimage Studies at William & Mary College and with the International Working Group WESIP's War and Environmental History, where they meet every 2 years to have congenial discussions about the history of horrible things. She has 2 children and 8 grandchildren who, like her, love travel, hiking, and having strenuous adventures. And tonight's presentation combines elements of all the above. Peggy, thank you so much for everything you do to help connect all of our community, and especially our kids, to the landscape that we work to protect. And thanks for putting this together for us tonight to kind of tell a very, very important but often hidden part of the history of the landscape that we protect.
Thanks, Keith. I'm glad you used the phrase hidden history, because to look at some of the landscapes that we're going to see tonight on the slides that I'll share with you, you wouldn't know it, right? You wouldn't know unless you'd read some index or a book or a paper in the history of our southern counties, south central counties in Pennsylvania, right along the Mason-Dixon line, that what happened happened. And it wasn't that long ago. So today when we visit our preserves, Lancaster Conservancy preserves, especially along the Susquehanna, but in the case of Welsh Mountain further out, we see these beautiful, bucolic, almost pristine landscapes. And these landscapes are gorgeous when we're out for outdoor recreation, hiking, birding, observing wildflowers. But one thing we have to remember before I start the slides is that these landscapes contain their own memory. So there's landscape memory, and we might pick up on it if we see the occasional ruins or stone foundation, and we walk by, we hike by, we wonder, I wonder what that was. We might see a farmhouse on our drive to a preserve to park and go hike and think, oh, that looks old, right? Wonder how old that place is and what happened there. So these kinds of questions begin to take us into the realm of environmental history and landscape history. And that is landscape memory. It's a little bit of research, a lot of archival research within that, talking to people, reading books, papers, attending lectures, visiting your local historical society, York and Lancaster County, big shout out there. And then hiking these landscapes with all of this in mind. So let me go ahead and start our presentation for tonight. Get to the top. There we go. So I've reorganized or restructured a talk that I give about a specific route on the Underground Railroad, which I'll get into in a couple minutes, called the Pilgrim's Pathway. But I've restructured it now to include key Lancaster Conservancy nature preserves along both sides of the river. And then I'll talk about how we get into this Underground Railroad history and how these preserves that are now nature preserves, how these preserves, these sites in that long ago history were really pivotal, not only in regional history, but national history. So my focus will be on Lancaster Conservancy nature preserves as they are today and what happened in and around them a long time ago. But I want you to think too, as you begin to plan for your spring hiking and your summer hiking, the stories that these places tell within the context of that site as you're hiking up the trail, McCall's Ferry, but also in the context of the larger landscape surrounding it. So things don't happen in isolation. And this is really true of our nature preserves on both sides of the river. They're all connected by this emancipation landscape memory. So before we get into Pilgrim's Pathway and all of these really great stories, we have to understand what separates Pennsylvania from Maryland. And it's a line, it's a boundary, it's a border, right? And this border was established by Mason-Dixon 250 years ago to stop the fighting between Pennsylvania and Maryland as colonies. They were not states yet. There was a big territorial dispute, and it was bloody. It lasted about 80 years, where there was a misunderstanding or a miscalculation in what should have been the boundary between these two colonies. The surveyor and the astronomer were brought in from England. They landed in Philadelphia and began their work in 1765 to end this dispute once and for all by drawing a line. And this was all done mostly at night by laying a track, by mapping the stars, following the constellations. They mapped around Wilmington, as you can see in the slide. They mapped the border between Delaware and Maryland, and then they started that long walk to draw the boundary line all across the southern border of Pennsylvania. So this seemed to end this low burn war between the two colonies, and it was war. And this kind of, once the line was established, calmed things down. So if you're traveling from Maryland into Pennsylvania, you see the brown signs. They're just about everywhere in Hartford and Cecil County as you cross over into Pennsylvania. This line over time, not too much time, but in the early 1800s began to designate not just the state boundary, but it began to designate the boundaries between a free northern region and the southern region, which used slavery as its main source of labor for mostly agricultural pursuits. In Maryland, it was tobacco, central Maryland. Um, Early 1800s, Montgomery County and Howard County, anywhere from 25% up to 35% of the population of those two Maryland counties were enslaved people. So as the idea of Underground Railroad grew and the legal system, the federal courts, made a pivotal decision called the Fugitive Slave Act, 1850. The flow of people north to cross the Mason-Dixon line into Pennsylvania quadrupled from when the line was laid up to the early 1800s, 1803, 1804. And then by the 1820s and 30s, there's truly a current of people coming from central Maryland, crossing through and coming from Baltimore County, Cecil County, Hartford, the eastern shore of Maryland, and Delaware. So this idea of Underground Railroad, let me clarify that most of the freedom seekers, now legally at the time, they were called fugitives because they were breaking a law, but they were searching for their freedom to escape enslavement, bondage. Most of the people who made this journey across the Mason-Dixon line did so on their own. They they made the journey on their own, maybe getting help here and there from sympathetic farmers who were Quakers, Germans, free blacks, free black communities. Most people did this on their own. But something shifted in the legal landscape that caused a real flow of people to begin to move up from central Maryland into York County. So where do we find these preserves that hold this memory, hold this history? So on our webpage, you can find a preserve. And so any of the preserves that I feature in tonight's presentation, you can find on this page if you want to visit. You can find their trail maps, how to get there. But what you'll see are these beautiful landscapes. Like I said, almost pristine landscapes, waterfalls and lush, beautiful forest. But these places hold this memory. From our webpage, the Find a Preserve page, we have this map with all these little pins dropped on it. And there's the Susquehanna, this beautiful blue line that flows diagonally through. To the left of that blue line, to the left of the Susquehanna River, is York County, and to the right of that blue line, the Susquehanna River, is Lancaster County. And so you'll see within the Susquehanna Riverlands Conservation Area, we have a lot of preserves from north of Wrightsville, Columbia, the Hellam District, all the way down the river, almost to the Mason-Dixon line. So these preserves not only designate these beautiful landscapes, but with a little bit of history, as you hike, you can begin to read this landscape and interpret what may have happened here, again, within the larger context of national, state, and social history. So I'm going to feature a number of preserves tonight that you can find on that Find a Preserve webpage, but I'm also going to be referring to things that happened outside of the boundaries of these preserves as they exist today. So McCall's Ferry, there's a number of preserves that we maintain that are named for a ferry that ran across the river before there were bridges. McCall's Ferry is on the York County side. And if you look across in this particular slide, you can see that there's a bunch of other conserved landscape on the other side. Kelly's Run, Holtwood are Lancaster Conservancy landscapes. The Energy Company, PP&L, maintain and conserve landscapes related to the dam, the Holtwood Dam, that is really close by. The idea that things don't happen in a vacuum is true here. So if you're up hiking along McCall's Ferry, which is a beautiful preserve that contains a gorgeous rapid drop stream with beautiful little tumbling waterfalls, In the summer, it's lush, almost tropical. But if you do so as you hike upstream away from the river towards the state game lanes, where you might be spotting another car, or maybe all the way up there and turn around and come back, you're walking across a landscape that in the 1830s was a really dangerous place to be if you were Black, especially if you were moving through on an Underground Railroad route, self-emancipation, um, and even if you were being assisted by abolitionists or sympathizers to the abolition movement. So let's take a look at that. So here you see McCall's Ferry at the top of the map. And here's Mill Creek Falls at the lower section of the map, which was one of our newest preserves. It's gorgeous. But right between the two, on the York County river boundary, you see that orangey pinkish circle. So in March 1837, there was a kidnapping whereby slave catchers, usually a group, a posse of white men, would raid a local farm or a Black business and take people. And this was a really famous case of slave catching. And it goes all the way to the US Supreme Court with the case Prigg versus Pennsylvania. So if you're hiking on these two preserves and connected by the Mason-Dixon Trail, just up the hill from where you're walking, this event took place where a free Black woman who had been released from bondage by her owner in Harford County took her children and herself and married a free Black man in York County. They lived there for several years until, in the bigger picture of US economics and the slave trade itself, capturing Black people who were either freedom seekers, runaways, or free Black because they could, and then sell them back into slavery was really profitable. And at the time, early 1830s up through 1850, the landscapes of York County were mostly agricultural, but still held a lot of forested tracts like what exists now in Mill Creek and McCall's Ferry. So it was easy to kind of be isolated. It was easy for these gangs, these posses to roam around undetected and wait for the right moment. And that's what happened on McCall's Ferry Road in late March 1837. A free Black woman who had been set free by her master in Harford County was recaptured, sold back into slavery along with all of her children, leaving her husband without the family. He later is, we think, murdered on the Susquehanna and Tidewater Canal. We never hear from these people again. There's no record in the archives of where they ended up, but we do know that they were taken to Baltimore. So what did McCall's Ferry look like back in the day? So this beautiful painting by German landscape painter Hermann Herzog depicts what that ferry would have looked like at about the time that Margaret Morgan and her family were kidnapped. And these were flat boats that were propelled by oar or poled over, sometimes cabled over. The river doesn't look like it does now, being held back in giant pools by the dams. So the ferries you were kind of at the mercy of the river's moods. So you weren't running the ferry when it was at flood, and you weren't running the ferry when it was low water. It had to be just right to make that crossing from McCall's Ferry over to about where Holtwood is now today. So in terms of this Underground Railroad route, and we'll get back to Margaret Morgan in a minute, lots of folks during the early 1800s up to about 1837, that's an important date for us, especially those who were seeking their freedom on their own, would walk up along the Susquehanna River following the Tidewater Canal. Of course, you couldn't take a boat upstream on the canal. The canal only operated downstream from Wrightsville to Havre de Grace, but you could take a ferry across. And at the time, early 1800s, seeing a Black family, single Black men, Black women, moving across the river on ferries wasn't a big deal. York County and Lancaster had thriving free Black communities. So there was always movement back and forth across the river on these ferry systems. But when the ferry wasn't able to operate, and there's a lot of ferries that operated from the Mason-Dixon line all the way up to Wrightsville, Columbia, about 18 in all, you were kind of bound to the York County side until you could find a safe way across. The furthest north you could go, where there were reliable ferries most of the time, of course, the river had its moods, were up near our two existing preserves, the Robert A. Kinsley Preserve in Hellam and Wizard Ranch, Accomack. And there were two ferries that operated from each of the mouths of creeks that dump through those two preserves today. A very popular one at Wildcat Run, almost a tourist ferry. But these two crossings, which are Glatz's and the Accomack Ferry, were about the farthest people would go on foot or by horseback to cross the river at a further ferry crossing point. Those who crossed over at this point, who chose not to take a bridge and use the ferry system, were probably on their way to Columbia to meet up with Black businessman William Whipper, very successful businessman in Columbia, and he was a major station master on the Underground Railroad. So there's the railroad vocabulary that goes along with the roles people played in the abolition movement. A station master meant that people knew to go towards his home or his businesses to receive directions on where to go from there. Sometimes they could find food, a new set of clothes. Oftentimes their names were written in journals or on an index that cited their slave name, and they adopted or were given a free name. So some of these journals actually can be found in Lancaster Historical Society and York as well. So these journals, these logbooks of people shedding their enslaved name and adopting their free person name, in Columbia is significant. So right across the river from Wizard Ranch and the Robert Kinsley Preserve, you have Marietta and the town of Columbia, and this was a goal to get across the river. The Susquehanna Tidewater Canal, if you're hiking on the Mason-Dixon Trail, the scene on the right's probably really familiar to you. That's Lock 12, which is just down the hill from our Mill Creek Preserve at the Normanwood Bridge, a PP&L property, but it connects beautifully to our preserves as you follow the Mason-Dixon Trail, which is blue blazed up along the York County side of the river. And like I said, the boats were traveling south, so it didn't do you much good to try to hitch a boat ride to go back to Havre de Grace. But in the picture on the left, do you see the Black family walking along? There were free Black communities up and down the canal route, and they were employed by the canal boat businesses. They were employed as workers in the canal. And so to see a Black family moving along the canal towpath or the road on either side was not unusual. But when this abduction occurred in York County in 1837, it signaled a change in the way freedom seekers were perceived on this landscape, simply because a Black person was worth more at the Baltimore slave auctions. And there were some incredibly bad guys who operated as posses, as gangs, groups of slave catchers, auctioneers, and one in particular who ran a shipping business from the port of Baltimore to New Orleans. And so what happens after this 1837 abduction is that Pennsylvania and Maryland go at it again. You know, once a person crosses over the Mason-Dixon line, Pennsylvania argues that they should be given personal liberty. So we have the personal liberty laws that go into play. Those slaveholding states argued the opposite, that they are property. They're still property even after they cross the Mason-Dixon line. So it became big business. And I'm just going to put it bluntly out there. Slave catching, slave trading, and slave selling became big business as the price on people's heads rose and rose. Why did that happen? About 1839, 1840, a big shift happens in the national landscape in agricultural industry. And what happens is that more workers are needed in the Deep South. The rice plantation industry begins to expand rapidly. Sugar, tobacco is kind of dying out in Maryland in the mid-Atlantic. So what to do with these excess slaves, to put it bluntly, is to sell them south. They're worth a lot for these plantations and these landscapes where slave labor is highly valued. So to catch free Black people like Margaret Morgan and her entire family of children would have meant a pretty big take-home paycheck for that posse that kidnaps them from the farm on McCall's Ferry Road. So here's Shanks Ferry Wildflower Preserve, which is beautiful, right? Who doesn't love going to Shanks Ferry? But there's that little dotted line across the river. And here's another ferry crossing. If it was safe to do so, after the prices in the South for slave labor begin to rise, people start making the crossing at night. So imagine crossing to Shanks Ferry, and if you've hiked there, you know what a steep valley that is. The topography of the river hills is steep ravines and high cliff-like hillsides, and you can see by the topographic map on this slide how tightly those lines are put together, those red lines define the steepness, the deep incised creek valleys and those high cliffs. And then you have this one ferry crossing, which is at the base of a creek, usually crossing the river to the base of another creek, flatland to flatland. And this is where, after 1837, and certainly as the Fugitive Slave Act is enacted by Congress in 1850, this is where the slave catchers would hang out. So they're forcing people who are trying to cross the river to cross in very dangerous conditions. So if you stand at Shanks Ferry now, and you look up over the railroad at the river across the way, imagine making that crossing at night and fearful for who may be waiting for you at the other side. Is it a station master? Is it a local conductor on the Underground Railroad? Are you on your own to make your way through this very rugged and steep landscape? Shanks Ferry. So I'm going to focus now on, I live in Peach Bottom Township. So I'm sadly kind of proud of this history. It's not a nice history to have, but I'm really proud of the history in regards to the number of abolitionists who lived within just a few miles of where my cabin is, especially those Quaker communities that still live in the area. These families have been here for generations, and they played a huge part in moving people across the Susquehanna. Let me explain why the Susquehanna is so important at this point. Prior to the 1830s, people seeking their freedom would often just get on the train out of Baltimore and ride it up to Havre de Grace. If the coast was clear, continue riding the train across the bridge into Cecil County and onwards to Philadelphia. That was usually where people were headed, to Philadelphia, where they knew they could get the aid, the mutual aid, directions, food. Maybe they'll just stop and live in Philadelphia. But that was usually the goal by crossing the Susquehanna. As the economic landscape changed in our country and slave labor became more valuable, the transatlantic slave trade is ended in 1808. So now it's just kind of an in-house slave trade. We call that inbound slave trade, inward bound slave trade. So when all this is happening, it's a little, well, it's a lot dangerous to be traveling by yourself or with your family without an escort or without a disguise because those slave catchers are hanging around the train stations and they're definitely hanging around Havre de Grace. So in 1840s, the train no longer is a safe option to take across the river into Cecil County. And a lot of freedom seekers get off the train in Havre de Grace and begin following the Susquehanna and Tidewater Canal up through Harford County into York County, and they cross the line. There's a little dotted line in that illustration there on the left. That's the Mason-Dixon line. And you see all those little dots that cross the river? Those are ferry routes, depending on the level of the river is. And this is from Peach Bottom, York County, to Peach Bottom, Lancaster County. There's like twin townships that face each other, still do, on the river. But as people are traveling up through Harford County into York County, they are helped if they want the help, and often they did, by these Quaker meetings, communities of Quakers, German farmers once they cross the line into York County. And again, the goal is Philadelphia. So if we can get across the river safely with some help, the Peach Bottom Ferry was usually their first opportunity in a free state, air quotes, right? Free state, because you were being hunted at this point. Once you've crossed the Mason-Dixon line, you're worth more. This was your first opportunity to get into Lancaster and make about a 30-mile walk or wagon ride or horseback ride to Christiana, which is where you could catch a train on into Philadelphia, or if you crossed further up, you would meet the station master there, William Whipper, and catch the train at Columbia, which would go through Christiana on its way through Ackland and on to Philadelphia. But this was, we're seeing this steam-powered ferry. This is a much later picture. There was no steam power at the time of these early crossings. They were pole boats, flat-bottom boats. And so here's where my local history, I'm just so proud of it. I still belong, my father belonged to the Quaker meeting in Darlington, Harford County. It's not far from where I live. And so these freedom seekers were being escorted, shepherded, hidden up along the York County side to these ferry crossings. And at night, right? At night, it's not this beautiful daytime shot of this steam ferry. These are nighttime crossings. And one of the families that was instrumental, a free Black family in Peach Bottom Township, farmers who had been farming in the Peach Bottom area for a long, long time, would assist freedom seekers across by meeting at certain trees, by meeting at certain crossings, crossroads, knocking on the door of people's houses. All this information was passed to freedom seekers kind of on the sly, right? You don't want to advertise the fact that you're looking for information, and if you're an abolitionist, you don't want to advertise the fact you're helping, because you can be jailed too as a white helper, as someone who's assisting people on this route. So the son of this couple of Black farmers the Wades who operated basically the ferry on the York County side to meet with a free Black community on the Lancaster side, did a lot in their 10 or 15 years of operating this rowboat, basically, rowboat ferry. And their son later says in an oral history transcript, he's very proud of the work they did. I'll just read this from the slide. The ferry at Peach Bottom played a pivotal role in facilitating this journey. Remember, it's the first one you come across after crossing the Mason-Dixon line. So his parents serving as a lifeline for freedom seekers aided by conductors stationed out of Havre de Grace. So there's the Quakers. With the help of the conductors, that could be Quakers, German farmers, free Black, once they're across the Mason-Dixon line. The freedom seekers risked their lives traveling north through the terrain of southern York County, embodying the spirit of solidarity and resistance against the shackles of enslavement. Thus, Peach Bottom remains an enduring testament to the indomitable human spirit and the relentless pursuit of liberty amidst adversity. That's the son of two of the most famous unknown. I know that's kind of odd to say that. The two most famous and unknown Underground Railroad conductors from Peach Bottom. Usually the first people that folks would meet as they came across the Mason-Dixon line. What did that ferry look like? So on the right is a painting I did. It's just a little sketch of what it might have looked like at night. A torch was lit, usually a cattail torch. The fluff from cattail is pretty long burning to signal the folks on the other side at the mouth of Peters Creek, Fern Cliff, which is another one of our preserves, and at the mouth of Fishing Creek in Drumore, that there were folks waiting on the York County side to come across. This was a nighttime crossing. Benjamin Grant writes or said in an oral history, the night was never too dark or the storm too severe for those brave, noble-hearted men to do their work. They did not fear death, although they were uneducated men, ignorant of the letter. They were directed by a higher power. The hand of God led them, and so they succeeded in carrying across hundreds, nay, I truthfully say thousands, from the counties of Cecil, Hartford, and Baltimore. All lived to be old men. So these were the free Black farmers, the free Black logging communities, fishing communities that operated this particular Peach Bottom ferry. And once people made it to the Lancaster side, they called this route now, once you set foot in Lancaster County, you were on the Pilgrim's pathway. If you visit the Peach Bottom Marina on the Lancaster County side, this is one of the National Park Service's Network to Freedom signs. It's in the parking lot at the Peach Bottom Marina to show a scene of what it might have looked like crossing the river at night. I'm not going to read that to you, but I hope you go visit it on your way to Fern Cliff or Fishing Creek. But there's a sign there that designates that landing spot. So Fishing Creek and Fern Cliff are framed by, again, those steep ravine creeks. And, as a path out, there were probably wagon roads that have existed in these creeks. Like at Mill Creek, there's a wagon road that's got to be 200 years old. And the same is true for these big, deep ravine creeks on the Lancaster County side in the River Hills. These are old paths that follow the creek. It's the only way to get up these steep cliffs is to follow these steep ravine streams up and out onto the plateau overhead. So the orange circles on this map provided by researcher and historian Charles Stotts in 1966 in his paper called The Pilgrim's Pathway shows where Fishing Creek up in Drumore and Ferncliff down right on the river are in relation to each other. Below Ferncliff, you see the number 16 and that dotted line that kind of follows Peters Creek up. That was sort of the official landing place if you were coming across in the Peach Bottom Peach Bottom Ferry. But remember, people are watching and waiting. They were wanting to steal people and sell them back into slavery. So sometimes it wasn't a good idea to get off at Peters Creek, and they were directed to walk up the railroad towards what is now Ferncliff or further up towards Fishing Creek. And we know that there were conductors and station masters. There were sympathetic folk all through this area. No matter how rugged the terrain, there was usually someone around watching over them and ready to help if freedom seekers asked for that help. The knock on the door, the light in the window. Again, you didn't want to advertise that you were helping because after the Fugitive Slave Act, it is illegal to assist freedom seekers. It's illegal to assist fugitives, and you as a helper, as an abolitionist helper, could land in jail as well. So from that paper by Mr. Stotts, 1966, this is in the paper. He's listing all the places that were stations or safe houses on the Pilgrim's Pathway from the crossing at Peach Bottom all the way up to Christiana, and then on the train. If you got that far safely, jump on the train and head to Philadelphia. A lot of the families you see under the stations list, the men who are listed and the women, those families are still in the area, as are descendants who of freedom seekers who decided that they were going to make Lancaster County their home. They weren't going to go any further. So we have several descendant communities in Lancaster County and York County once they're across the Mason-Dixon line. So I wanted to bring up what happens in 1851, and we're going to tie in Welsh Mountain now, which is a beautiful preserve. I think it's our furthest east preserve in Lancaster County. So in 1851, the road sign, if you look at the road sign in the upper right corner of the slide, it says the Christiana Riot. It's actually a resistance, and that's how we refer to it now, the Christiana Resistance. There were some freedom seekers who escaped a farm in Baltimore County and decided to stop running in the Christiana area. Mr. Parker, and they set up shop, they became farmers until their former owners, the Gorsuch family, Mr. Gorsuch found out where they were through a series of spies and slave catchers who were keeping an eye open. So the Fugitive Slave Act has passed in 1850. And so now it's illegal to stop someone from reclaiming their property in Pennsylvania. So if you were protecting or hiding someone in Pennsylvania and you were caught doing it, you could be jailed right along with any other felon or criminal for doing something against the law. This armed resistance happened when the slave owners from Baltimore County came to claim their property. Again, that difference in how human rights was interpreted, depending on where you were coming from south of the Mason-Dixon line or whether you're residing north of it. The Quakers there, Quakers are generally pacifists, but not this bunch. They sounded the alarm. Mr. Parker and residents of this farmhouse, which is no longer standing, sounded an alarm by blowing a horn to let people all through the area know that there were slave catchers coming right for them. There was a battle, a hand-to-hand battle. The slave owner, Mr. Gorsuch, is killed in that battle. And they take sort of prisoner the farmer's son, who is almost mortally wounded. But the Quakers who were there to help defend these freedom seekers who were living in the house take care of him. And he notes later in his journals and his diary and in interviews how well he was taken care of by the people who for whom he was trying to take this free Black family, or then free Black family, as property back. So this is an armed resistance. This is the first time that that a Black community and a Quaker community and a German farming community take up arms against slave catchers and people wanting to reclaim their property. So there's Mr. Parker holding the machete that he wielded to chase people out of the house. So what happens after the battle ends? You've got a dead farmer from Maryland. You've got his son who's basically been captured, but being nursed back to health. The federal agents come in, they round everybody up, but our two now free Black men take off. They're sheltered on their way up through the Welsh Mountain area. They go all the way to Canada to truly be out of harm's way. And then word comes down that their families can then be moved to Canada as well. It's not as simple as saying, oh, you just go to Canada. I mean, that's an arduous journey all of itself. But this was the first time right here, right across the Mason-Dixon line, that an armed resistance took place. So where did they go? Free Black folks in the area, whether they were free Black because they self-emancipated or whether they were free black because they were born in the state of Pennsylvania, were really rattled by what happened in the Christiana resistance. So a lot of people fled to those northern hills in Lancaster County, the Welsh Mountain area in particular, to hide out until things calmed down. Some people stayed. There's a descendant community between the Zurcher Hotel in Christiana and Welsh Mountain area where people fled, um, the violence and then just settled where they decided to settle and hide. So if you have the chance to visit the Zurcher's Hotel, which is uh, where the captives were taken, the federal agents captured the abolitionist helpers and the free blacks who helped defend Parker and his associates were all taken here and put in shackles on the second floor of this hotel right by the railroad in Christiana. It's a wonderful site to visit. Um, Darlene Collin is the manager, and she is now the president of the Christiana Historical Society. Call ahead, ask for a tour. It's not open regularly unless an event is happening, so do check their hours. And this group standing in front of the Zurcher Hotel is a group, oh, I see Randy Harris there too, local historian from Lancaster. We walked from our Quaker meeting in Darlington all the way to Christiana. It was about give or take 35 to 40 miles. We did it over 3 days to try to retrace the route of the Pilgrim's pathway. Darlene is a descendant of one of the resistors. Ezekiel Thompson is her, I think, fifth great grandfather. And so she's a living descendant of the Christiana resistance, as are several people in the descendant community right there in Christiana and near Welsh Mountain. Thaddeus Stevens gets involved. He takes on the case, and when this group is transferred to a prison in Philadelphia, he gets them off. So they don't go to court. They're not punished. They're not imprisoned except for the holding until the case could be heard. And so our hero, Thaddeus Stevens, whose office was in Lancaster, which is now, I think, the next Network to Freedom, Network to Freedom site is coming up as a museum now, will be featured soon. But his office and his accessibility to these landscapes was pretty common and pretty intense. And here he is writing a letter in 1847 to say, look, I've got spies out there just like you do. So not only were people watching to capitalize on slave stealing and slave catching, there were also spies employed by the lawyer Thaddeus Stevens and later congressman or representative to spy on the spiers. So they kind of knew where everybody was going. There were signals, there were, calls, there were different ways of signaling where to go, where not to go, depending on who was waiting. But here he is right in the thick of it in Lancaster County. So Welsh Mountain, beautiful preserve. And I think the iconic species for me is the pink lady slipper. So there it is in the right corner. But when you hike here today, and you hike this system of trails, these trails go right through the landscape where these people fled as the Christiana resistance flared up and really began a period in American history right before the Civil War that was defined by a lot of violence in and around the Mason-Dixon line, Lancaster, York County, Adams County. There was a flare-up of violence. And we have to remember, as we walk these landscapes, people were hiding here. Many people stayed, but then again, many people continued north to Canada or into New York. Some people went home to southern Lancaster County when things died down. But yeah, this was a landscape that was defined at the time by violence. And we have to remember that, as lush and as beautiful as it is today. So our landscapes as they appear today, here's our group hiking from Darlington. We're on the Mason-Dixon Trail on the right-hand picture there, hiking up from the river up into the hills in York County. And this Mason-Dixon Trail, like I said earlier, cuts through many of our preserves in and along the river on the York County side. And so this is what these scenes look like today. But for that one little piece of time, from 50 to 100 years during the inbound slave trade, where the prices were high on people's heads, the slave catching and stealing was just rife throughout our Mason-Dixon area, these landscapes were not so pristine. They weren't so safe to go for a day hike, especially if you were a person of color or you were aiding and assisting people of color through this landscape. So one of my favorite landscape historians and observer of landscapes, Mayfield Watts, wrote in the book, Reading the Landscape of America. She says, there's good reading on the land, first-hand reading, no symbols. The records are written in forests and fence rows and bogs and playgrounds, gardens, pasture, tree rings. The records were made by sun and shade, by wind, rain, fire, and time, and by animals. And this is how we see our landscapes today. But remember that these landscapes hold that memory of the Underground Railroad, and certainly the memory of secreting people across the Mason-Dixon line, getting across the river and directing them to safer places. I think, if I'm right, we're going to share this PowerPoint through a recording on our YouTube channel. So you can go through this recording and see the references that I've put here. And so here's just some of the topics I talked about tonight. I do want to talk about, before we end, the book in the right upper left-hand corner, Business of Slavery. It was big business in Baltimore. Family fortunes were made on slave trading, particularly when the need for slaves in Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida skyrocketed due to a change in cropping culture, especially rice, indigo, and sugar. So you can check out those resources. I have to do a tip of the hat to our local historians. I used quite a bit the book by Scott Mingus, which is upper left-hand corner in this reference slide, and Milt Diggins's book, Stealing Freedom Along the Mason-Dixon Line. So yeah, grab these books at the local library, or if you really want to add them to your collection at home, grab these too. Scott Mingus has written a lot of stuff, and Milt Diggins, one of our treasured local historians as well. A little bit about the Supreme Court case, the Prigg versus Pennsylvania. Check out Jim McClure's articles. Now retired editor of the York Daily Record. If you're here, Jim, hey. And then Nick Musfik's On This Day, Supreme Court Decides Prigg versus Pennsylvania. Really good resources as well. So I'm going to stop share and jump back into my Brady Bunch screen. Hey, Keith.
Hey, Peggy. Wow. That's incredible. So just kind of an observation, oh, two observations, I guess. I'll start with the first one, that, the stories that you told of this history are unpleasant to hear. They're difficult to listen to, especially the story of the mom and her kids being stolen back into slavery. But at the same time, it's really important that we don't forget that that's part of our collective reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other piece of this, though, for me is the hope attached to it, right? That there were people who saw that this was wrong and did something about it at great risk to themselves. And so, in spite of the danger, they did what they felt was right. And that, I think, is, to me, is hopeful, right?
Yeah.
And I've been hanging on the hope thing a lot lately. And as the work of us as a conservancy, I think, is hopeful work. That we are facing so many problems in every realm, and so just staying focused on the environmental for now, it feels overwhelming to me at times. And then I look at this scrappy little mighty nonprofit land trust that's been able to cobble together money to protect 10,000 acres in our 50-year history on 51 preserves, and well, 50 going to be 51 here shortly. And then do a really great job of stewarding that land, then engaging a whole conservation community that's forming around that work. I mean, that to me is hope. And then attach to that a whole nother layer of knowledge, like walking to Shanks Ferry the same way now, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was always a sacred place to me just because of the natural beauty that was there. But then when I learned about the indigenous peoples and their relationship to that particular part of land, and now a whole nother layer of people seeking freedom, using the ruggedness of that terrain as cover to get to that freedom, I can never look at that place the same way again.
Yeah, that's so true. And when I go to Ferncliff and Fishing Creek, we'll have a hike later in the year, I think, with KTA, walking up Fishing Creek to tell these stories. You know, to stand there at a creek crossing or at a ferry crossing, whether it's Shanks or at Ferncliff or down below, um, and to think that in the span of what a human generation, 30, 40, 50 years, 1,000 people came up that road from the ferry crossing and walked up through Ferncliff up onto the plateau and hopefully made it to Christiana, or maybe they continued up the shore of Lancaster County along the river and made it as far as Columbia and then onwards by train to places further north, or did they stay put? But since I've been looking at this history, and certainly since we hiked it as a group from our Quaker meeting, um, and I hope it doesn't sound too weird to say this, but knowing this history, I can almost feel them there. Does that sound corny?
Well,
But
I mean,
yeah,
not
the
not to
top,
me. I get
yeah,
that. I totally get that.
yeah. So it's like their memory, the memory of these events is not forgotten. Therefore, to me, they're still occupying this landscape on their way. So I like to think about that as we're hiking those ravine creeks.
And just a statement that shows how much more work we have to do on this, right? I
Yeah.
remember when you did that pilgrimage, and what was that, 5 years ago?
It was about
Six?
five. It was during the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
20. Yep.
And how you were genuinely fearful for the safety of the people participating in that pilgrimage because of a threat that you received.
We
That
received
don't walk those people past my house.
Yep.
5 years ago in our
5 years
in
ago.
our community, right? So
Yes. But you
I
know
have a
what?
lot of hope. But go ahead.
We had people watching out for us though.
Yeah, right. So there's the other
That's
piece
not
of that, right? So there you have
right.
it. Yeah,
Yep. So
there's the
we had
hope.
help. We had hope. We had hope. We walked past this particular property where we had been threatened. Um, it was an interesting experience, but that reminded me that this is someone else's experience today. They might get a threat every day. This was our one occurrence, this one
Mm.
instance of being threatened for walking past a house with those people with us. Um, but yeah, it puts everything into perspective and such a context that that land memory, that landscape memory, is still living, and
Yeah.
we're living it.
Yeah. Well, Peggy, thank you so much for putting this together and sharing your knowledge with us. And thanks for doing this on the daily for the Conservancy and people that come out on interpret programs with you. I always love listening about, your interpretation of the landscape that's in front of us from a historical perspective and that tight interplay between human history and natural history so that we just can't separate it out. I mean, I know biologically we're made of the same things that stars are, right? Everything on the planet is made of the same basic elements, and the oxygen that I'm breathing in was just produced by a plant outside my window, and the CO2 I'm giving off is going to be taken in by that same pine tree. But this really cements that concept that you just can't separate out natural history from human history and the effect of society and culture on nature and
Yep.
nature on society and culture. And it just really ties it together. So thank you, thank you, thank you so much. Our next nature hour is February 19th. Talking about spring and summer wildflowers. Believe it or not, that is right around the corner. In fact, I do believe our skunk habit should be popping. I haven't had a chance to get down to the wetland at Climbers yet, but I'm hoping to do that tomorrow. And then that begins the beginning of our outdoor interpretive series. And so go to the events page, lancasterconservancy.org/events, and check out the huge slate of things we've got planned for the spring. Thanks for attending, everybody. Thanks again, Peggy. Good
See
night.
ya. Good night.